You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hi, everyone. Before I start the show, just a quick plug for the Arts Madness tournament we've got going on. A big thank you to everyone who's been voting every week. And this week, we're down to our final four. And it's really a fun collection I never would have expected to be in our final four. We have Ramiro Berteau up against Wayne Thiebaud. And then in the other bracket, we have Frank Lloyd Wright up against friend of the pod, Herb Williams. I'm eager to see who's going to advance to the finals, and I would encourage all of you to weigh in at whoartedpodcast.com/arts-madness or check the links in the show notes. Now, on with the episode.
I feel like who art ed.
We'll try to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today my guest is actually a fellow art history podcaster. You may be familiar with The Art of Crime. I think maybe a year or two ago, we did a little feed drop and I introduced my audience to The Art of Crime. Absolutely love the show. I've been a listener for a while, but Gavin Whitehead is coming on because he also has a new limited series that is absolutely fascinating, and I cannot wait to learn more about The Raven, the new show. So welcome to the pod, Gavin Whitehead. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I've been a listener for a while. I don't think it's a secret. I'm interested in art history and, the more sensational aspects, the art of crime. You've done such a great job with that. Like, it feels so immersive in the storytelling. I absolutely love it. You get into the weeds in a way that I don't have the time to produce in my own work. I appreciate it in the work of others. Now with The Raven, Not
it's
the
just
Raven.
Called Raven. Yeah.
I know. You're not Poe. I get it. But with Raven, you did a deeper dive, actually creating a whole series based on this one story. And I guess the first question I have is, what made this story stand out to you as one that you wanted to capture in a whole series instead of just like a single episode?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I do another podcast called The Art of Crime. It comes out in seasons, and each season is structured around a different theme. So one of my seasons was all about the historical Madame Tussauds and her wax museum. It was called Queen of Crime, Madame Tussauds, and the Chamber of Horrors. And I've just long been a fan of wax museums, and I've actually published some scholarship on Madame Tussauds in the past as well. And while I was working on that season of The Art of Crime, somehow or another, I was looking into the history of wax museums in New York. And I hit upon the African American Wax Museum of Harlem. I was interested right from the get-go just in the mere existence of a wax museum devoted to Black history. But then I started looking into the man who founded that museum, and I was just even more fascinated. His name was Raven Chanticleer. And I'm sorry, I don't care who you are. Like, if you hear that name, I mean, don't you want to hear more? But he was just this volume 11 personality, truly unforgettable human being, multi-talented artist. He painted, acted, sculpted, taught himself to model in wax. He really made his living as a fashion designer back in the 60s and 70s in New York. He also was a freelance journalist. And the more I found out about him, the more I wanted to know. And why did I get kind of hooked on the African American Wax Museum? Well, I found out that when Raven died in 2002, his family made the choice to gut the museum and sell the property, destroying his life's work and outraging several members of the community. And for many years, Raven's prized handmade wax statues that he exhibited in the museum were thought to have been lost to history, either thrown away or even some sources told me that they believed his family members had literally melted down the wax effigies. But it turns out that not all of these wax figures had been destroyed after all. And I wanted to find out what happened to them. And I did. And the more I kind of looked into the story, it just kept growing, growing, growing. I was like, this is a series. This is more than a one-off episode. This is a series. So when I talk about Raven, I kind of call it like part character study and part detective story, because I am as interested in the figure of Raven Chanticleer as I am in the African American Wax Museum as a cultural institution. And I'm also fascinated by various members of the community in Harlem who really went out of their way to try and find out what happened to these missing wax figures and try to keep the memory of this really important institution alive.
Oh, that is that is like the perfect trailer for the podcast right there. I am so fascinated already. I have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to try not to, dip into spoilers for this, but, listeners, if you want to hear it, the series is out now. The show is called Raven. You can check the links in the show notes, but, in a little bit, I want to get into Raven himself, but I am right off the bat so curious. Why did the family want to destroy his work right away? Did you come across that?
Yes.
Or is this going to ruin the thing if I ask that too early?
It's not a spoiler, but if you Google around, you can find an answer to this question. So word on the street was that Raven Chanticleer was a gay man, and he came from a socially conservative family who was also quite religious. And the rumor I kept hearing over and over again, both online and as I talked to sources for this podcast, was that his family members strongly disapproved of Raven's sexuality, and for that reason made a conscious decision to destroy everything that he had worked for. And I do think it's worth pointing out here that, I mentioned earlier that this was his life's work. Raven Chanticleer first had the idea to start his own wax museum devoted to Black history in the late 1950s. And he held on to that dream for 30 years, opened the wax museum in 1989, poured thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars into this enterprise, taught himself how to model in wax, did all the publicity, got all kinds of attention in the New York Times, the Village Voice. Italian Vogue wrote about this museum for some reason. So it meant the world to him. It truly meant the world to him. And his family destroyed everything. And that's why some people got so angry about what had happened. And that's part of why, the story resonated with me as strongly as it did. So I had heard over and over again this story about homophobic family members who had just destroyed the life's work of this hated gay relative. But this was all hearsay. And so a big question that I wanted to investigate as I looked into the story was there any truth to this? And I did manage, here's where I will refrain from spoiling, but after 18 months of working on again and off again on this project, I tracked down Raven's last surviving nephew, and I talked to him about why the family made the decisions they made.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I cannot wait to hear that. And now you've already alluded to the fact that you've spent quite a while on this, doing a lot of research, and you've talked to a number of people, including, family member there. I'm curious because obviously the Wax Museum was very significant to Raven. I mean, you said it was a dream he held on to for decades. Did you get anything from people who talked about the significance of the museum to them and what it represented to them as a cherished piece of culture and the history that it's preserving and uplifting? And, I would be curious to know, any insights you gleaned from those interviews.
Yeah. So I talked to a lot of people for this project. I should maybe say that it's sort of done in the style of a podcast like Serial or S-Town, This American Life. So it's kind of journalistic, and, I've scripted some text, but it's, interspersed with interviews with all these sources. Early on, I managed to talk to what must have been one of Raven's biggest fans. She's a playwright and poet and director and actor named Melanie Maria Goodrow, who's based in New York. And she was going to college in the early 1990s. The African American Wax Museum was open from 89 to 2002. And she was in college in Vermont. And she had a friend in New York. She said, hey, I want to go to the big city. It was her first time in the Big Apple. And she's like, I want to go to a museum because, hey, there are lots of museums to go to in New York City. What does she do? It's the 90s. So she opens up the phone book and goes to the yellow pages. Remember those? And she goes to museums and starts looking. Under A, the first one listed is the African American Wax Museum of Harlem. And Melanie is Black and was really interested in Black culture, interested in learning more about Black culture. And the museum was located in Harlem. And of course, Harlem holds a really special place in Black American history. So she was just like, yes, please, check, check, check. I'm going. She went. It became the first museum she ever went to in New York. She now lives there. She got a private tour from the man himself, Raven Chanticleer, and she just could not speak highly enough of this museum. And it was so important to her for a number of reasons. Partly it was because Raven gave these guided tours. And he is just this guy, no matter how you felt about the African American Wax Museum, and there were some detractors, we can talk about that if you like. If you met Raven Chanticleer, you were never going to forget him. Like, everyone I spoke to for this project agreed on that point. He was just like 6 feet tall, at least, very handsome, former fashion designer with a penchant for the outrageous, just like dressed to impress at all times, very stentorian. He would just like project his voice as if he were a stage actor, no matter how far away you were from him. And just very, very proud of himself and his work. So part of it was just like who he was as a person, but the oozing creativity. This museum, it was located in the basement of a brownstone that he owned in Harlem. And it exhibited not just about 24 wax figures of important figures from Black history, whom he referred to as the heroes and sheroes of Black history, but it also contained dozens of paintings, all of which Raven Chanticleer had painted himself, as well as just like bizarre tchotchkes, like a beer can candelabra that he had made, like a lamp that he made out of popsicle sticks. So it's just this like totally weird, bizarre place, and there was music playing and scented candles burning, and Melanie referred to him as like an artist's artist. So it's just like game recognizes game, kind of is why she cared so much about it. But another thing that really resonated with her was this was the 90s. And the reason Raven wanted to open this wax museum was because back in the 50s, this is kind of the story that he told, he went to Madame Tussauds in London and he just fell in love with the medium of wax. He wanted to learn how to model in wax. At the same time, he was really disappointed to note that there were no Black figures in Tussauds' collection. And he was like, what's up with that? And he said, you know what? If there's no representation of Black culture here, I'm going to open my own wax museum. And that's why he did it. So he wanted to, highlight a history and a culture and an identity, you could say, that had kind of gone unrepresented in bigger institutions like Madame Tussauds. And so Melanie really dug the political dimension to that project as well.
Yeah. And, you've already mentioned, he had figures of the, as you said, the heroes and the sheroes of Black history. Can you just tell us who were some of those big figures that earned a place in the museum?
So there were quite a few. You had a lot of the household names like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, whom Raven liked to call the dusty diva of the Underground Railroad. He gave her aviator sunglasses to wear too. So kind of like wildly and intentionally anachronistic in the way that he dressed his wax figures. So Martin Luther King Jr. was in there, Paul Robeson, Mary McLeod Bethune, Whoopi Goldberg was in there. and Josephine Baker. Who else? I read in one account that he actually had a wax figure of Jeffrey Dahmer, the serial killer. No idea why. Slightly incongruous. But Raven, he was an eccentric. Like,
Clearly.
and I think he prided himself on his own eccentricity. So, I mean, in one newspaper account I read, someone like the journalist had clearly asked him why he wanted to open a wax museum, and he just said, "I don't know, just craziness, you know." And I feel like that captures, or it might help to explain why Jeffrey Dahmer was also represented in this museum. But yeah, that's a smattering of some of the figures who were represented in there.
So the next thing I'm curious about is you say like Harriet Tubman and aviators and anachronistic dressing. Is that because, or I guess, you can't necessarily speak for the man, but in your research, your estimation, does that seem like that was a curatorial decision in order to make the figures seem more relatable to a contemporary artist and show some personality? Or was that him putting his own personality and spin on these things because it's all Raven's world and the rest of us are just in it?
I think it's a little bit of both. So I mentioned earlier that Raven was a fashion designer, right? And he, like, back in the 70s, he had this reputation for designing like capes that people could wear. And, like the Supremes might have gone to shop for their outfits at Raven's chateau, as he liked to call it. That was what he called his workshop. He was a freelance fashion designer. So he had this this real flair, and he brought that to the Wax Museum because he designed all the clothes that the figures wore. And for him, I think here it's really interesting to compare something like the African American Wax Museum to an institution like Madame Tussauds. So if you go back to like Madame Tussauds in the 19th century, the real Madame Tussauds, prided herself on acquiring clothing that the figures depicted in her museum had actually worn. So she would pay like huge sums to get, for example, I believe it was the robes. It was like the kind of the finery that George IV had worn at his coronation in the early 1820s. She got those robes, paid like, I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, paid a good chunk of money so that she could dress her effigy of George IV in those robes and kind of recreate the coronation in her wax museum. So there was a real attention to verisimilitude in that regard. And that also held true for what the historical figures were wearing too. She wanted it to seem accurate and true to life. That is not what Raven was about, especially in the context of his fashion. And I think, and I will kind of just conjecture a little bit here, I think for him, it was more about just getting people excited by these figures that they were seeing. And part of how he wanted to do that was to dress them in these awesome, flashy, stylish outfits. So the figure of Josephine Baker, for example, was wearing this blood red bodysuit. Almost, do you remember Britney Spears's video for Oops, I Did It Again? It's on Mars. Did you ever see that?
I am of an age where I can never forget that, of course.
Me too, obviously. So it kind of looks like that is the point. It's like this blood red bodysuit, and then she has this white cape on. And Josephine Baker, as far as I can tell, never actually wore those clothes, but they just look awesome. And another thing that really endears Raven Chanticleer and his mission to me is that he made this museum because he wanted to inspire school children, especially Black school children, to learn more about Black history and to take pride in it. And so he's like not only showing them an effigy of Josephine Baker, who is this really important cultural figure who lived, but he's also just trying to engender that excitement. Like, look at how cool she looks in this with this long ponytail and these great clothes. And so I think he's trying to instill pride, excitement, and curiosity. It's sort of like, oh, who was Josephine Baker? Maybe the kids will go home and look her up, and in that sense, they can kind of educate themselves further on this really important figure from Black history.
Yeah. And I mean, like I say, it makes sense. I mean, you're trying to bring history to life, and that's why you've got the wax figures that are so realistic so people can see and have that experience. And I get a curatorial decision to try to give them something that is not necessarily historically accurate, but captures the vibe in a way that people can relate to.
Yeah. Yes.
Now,
more about vibes. That's the way to put it. Yes.
Now, after a short break, we've talked about the museum. I want to get a bit more into the man. Welcome back. My guest today is Gavin Whitehead, host of Raven, a new limited run podcast about, Raven and his wax museum. And I'm dying to know a bit more about the man himself, because I always love a good origin story. Can you tell us, where did Raven come from? How did he grow up? He held on to this dream for decades before it came to life. So, why was that so significant to him? I mean, yes, there are the obvious answers, but I'm sure there are also some hidden things in there. Can you give us the insights about Raven himself?
Absolutely. So Raven himself, like you, was very taken by origin stories. And I think the best place to start would be with the origin story that he gave to his visitors to his wax museum. So if you went to the wax museum back in, let's say, 1994, Raven would have greeted you at the door, and he would have given you a little bit of his own backstory. And he claimed that he was born and bred in Harlem. And, he had he had worked downtown for many years in New York and had been abroad. But now he had come back home to Harlem to open this wax museum. And supposedly he came from the Sugar Hill district, which is kind of like a well-bred bourgeois part of Harlem. And his parents had played host to Harlem luminaries like Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, who were also represented in the wax museum, I should say. So he kind of had this illustrious ancestry and a personal connection with Harlem. Now, part of why Raven Chanticleer was such a fascinating figure to New Yorkers was that some people kind of questioned whether any of this was actually true. And the truth about Raven's origin story actually did not come to light until when he died in 2002. And at his funeral, people who knew him quite well, and he was like a local celebrity. There were people like prominent politicians, restaurateurs, etc. in the crowd. I spoke to one, actually. I spoke to a woman named Norma Jean Darden, who modeled for Calvin Klein, Bill Blass, Ralph Lauren, big time model back in the 70s. She was friends with Raven Chanticleer. She since opened this really celebrated soul food joint in Harlem. She knew Raven for years, and she had gotten the same story about he came from Sugar Hill in Harlem. She went to the funeral and told me that one of Raven's family members got up and started talking about how Uncle James, was born in South Carolina in 1928 in a tiny town called Woodruff. And he had left home, completely reinvented himself, invented a new identity for himself, gone to New York, and just chased his dreams of becoming an artist. And everyone was shocked. People were shocked when they heard this at the funeral, because they'd known him for years and they had never had any insight into this part of his life. And if you go and look up Raven Chanticleer, you'll find that the New York Times published an obituary about him shortly after his death, and it foregrounds the fact that he was, I think the headline is something like Raven Chanticleer, artist and self-made man of wax. So they really foreground the extent to which he had fashioned himself. And you could even say kind of molded himself the way he did, molded his own identity the way he worked with wax, right? So yeah, he came from this small town. And again, it's small town. Jim Crow was still the law of the land. He was gay. It's reasonable to imagine that it was not an environment that would have been hospitable to someone like Raven Chanticleer / James Watson, which was his real name. And he just got out of there, like a lot of Black people at this time in history as part of the Great Migration. a lot of people went up northwards to New York in particular, and that's what Raven did. So he's a part of that history.
And so then, the part that is definitely firmly established in his biography is you said he found some success as a fashion designer. Can you tell us a little bit about his career in fashion?
Yes. So the thing that's tricky about Raven Chanticleer, so he had kind of like misled everyone about his origin story, right? So you have to be very skeptical about anything that he says about himself. So I'm going to start with that caveat. Because in terms of his fashion career, he claims to have designed for a lot of illustrious people, including Josephine Baker. And he was a freelance fashion designer. He started off, he claimed to have gotten his start. He claimed actually to have been the first Black designer at the upmarket store Bergdorf Goodman. I was never able to verify that. So it may or may not be true. But by about the early 70s, he had launched his own fashion workshop. He was designing all of his own clothes. And he told people that he designed, we know for a fact that he designed a necktie for Richard Nixon. And he actually got a thank you note. I can verify this because he got a thank you note from Richard Nixon, expressing his gratitude for the necktie.
Of all the figures I thought would come into this story, Richard Nixon would not have been on my bingo card.
Well, yeah. I mean, there are a lot. Yes. So that was one of them. He also claimed to have designed for like Eartha Kitt. He claimed to have designed for quite a few people. And part of me is like, were these commissioned, or was it a situation with Richard Nixon where maybe he just sent them these garments as a gift? And, he also actually, after, this is coming back to me right now, after Grace Kelly died, I believe he sent a gift to the estate. So, yeah.
So wow. Okay. So he had some level of success, but obviously unreliable narrator.
Very unreliable narrator.
So we don't know all the details, but we do know that the gay Black fashion designer was making stuff for Richard Nixon.
Josephine Baker and Richard Nixon. Yes. It's like really run the whole gamut there.
Yeah, that is so perfect in its way. And you said, the idea for the Wax Museum came from seeing Tussauds, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he saw. So I'm just trying to remember the timeline. You said he saw that and had the inspiration back in the 1950s.
Yes.
And then in 1989, he finally is able to bring that vision to life. So like, what was the process in gathering the materials, creating the work, putting it all together to actually make the thing happen? What was he doing in those years when he was shifting from dream to plan to actual implementation?
Yeah. So from the outset, he knew that he wanted to open the Wax Museum in Harlem. And as I mentioned a while ago, he was set up kind of in downtown New York for quite a few years when he was a professional fashion designer. So in the 80s, he actually moved uptown to Harlem and bought two brownstones right beside each other, which is a pretty large expense. And it actually speaks to the fact that he was successful. Like, he was successful enough as a fashion designer to afford to buy two pieces of property. Now, at Harlem at this time, it actually wasn't as I spoke to a historian named Jonathan Gill, who kind of wrote like an authoritative 400-year history of Harlem, starting all the way back in the colonial period and then going up to the 21st century. And he told me that what was not so hard at this moment, so in the 80s in Harlem, was it wasn't as hard to buy property, but the real expense lay in renovating it. So it could cost like thousands and thousands of dollars because you might have to put in new ceilings, new plumbing, et cetera, et cetera. And because Raven housed his wax museum in the basement of his brownstone. It's very DIY. He needed to renovate all that space to kind of pave the way for the institution to open there. So that took a lot of time and money.
Mm-hmm.
So over the course of multiple years, he was renovating. And then finally he starts to open in 1989. And so the process of making these models, he knew that even though he dressed his figures in wildly kind of anachronistic and fun ways, he did have some commitment to verisimilitude, to presenting these men and women the way they actually looked in real life, because he always went to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is a really important branch of the New York Public Library located in Harlem. And he would go there, find images of the people that he wanted to immortalize in wax, and then study those and then work from those later. So he claimed that he would make like the frames for each wax figure out of chicken wire, or like in paper mache, basically. So kind of like get a skeleton, and then he would just apply wax to the faces and hands, which is pretty much in keeping with what Tussaud was doing back in like the late 18th century and into the 19th century, incidentally. And then, like I said, he would design the clothing himself. And as soon as he opened in 1989. And at that point, I forget off the top of my head how many figures he had in the collection, but I think it was fewer than 10.
So he puts all that together. How does he get people to notice the museum? I mean, it's in the basement of a brownstone in Harlem.
Uh-huh.
How does he get the attention for this museum? Is he, hustling to get press releases out and get traditional stuff? Does he have a big grand opening? Like what's that look like?
So you're interested in Raven the Man earlier. One thing to know about Raven the Man is that he was a master of publicity. And so part of what put him on the map back in the 70s was that he would just show up to like really important gala events wearing his own creations. And they were just like, you'd have to scoop your jaw off the floor as soon as he walked in the door, right? So to give an example quickly, Muhammad Ali, there was the Muhammad Ali fought another boxer named Joe Frazier in the early 70s. It was billed as the fight of the century. It was like this huge cultural sensation at Madison Square Garden. Raven Chanticleer rolled up in a horse-drawn carriage wearing an ermine turban, an ermine maxi coat, and like brocade from head to toe and with matching boots, and like brought his own red carpet to walk and had a footman with a parasol like going into Madison Square Garden with him. And so everyone was just like, who is this guy? This guy is insane. And that's where he really starts to become like a New York, like a local celebrity, basically. So this guy he knows how to get attention. Okay. And he's just always been that way. So when the Wax Museum opened, he would put out press releases, but he also, and it's hard to say how exactly he forged these connections, but he did get it written about in the New York Times. There are multiple articles about it in the New York Times. And, I think the Wax Museum itself just had like a powerful resonance because it was located in Harlem, the site of the Harlem Renaissance, the capital of Black culture in America. And but it was hustling, and just he was also a freelance journalist, so I think he knew some writers who could help him out. Probably, I think we can reasonably infer that. And he also interfaced with schools throughout New York City, and there were a lot of field trips. Several people I spoke to remembered like visiting the Wax Museum as kids were leaving and getting on school buses to go back to school because they had just taken a field trip to the museum. So that was part of how he got the word out as well.
That's interesting. And then, as we've already said, it didn't last. And after one last break, I want to get into sort of how it all came to an end and the mysteries that you're running down in the podcast series. My guest, Gavin Whitehead, has the new podcast series, Raven. you can check it out on all the major platforms. Check the links in the show notes. And I'm just going to throw in another plug for The Art of Crime, because absolutely love that show. We've talked about that as well. If you want to learn more about other wax museums, he did a whole season on Madame Tussauds. So there's a lot of great content in there. But the Wax Museum in Harlem, it basically ended when Raven passed away in 2002. Can you tell us about what that closing looked like, and sort of the send off for it, and how all these pieces went missing or were destroyed, and what's going on there?
Yeah. So he always wanted the Wax Museum to stay open as soon as he died, because he cared deeply about his own legacy. And he told one radio journalist that he wanted to leave something behind. And that he even says in this radio interview from 2001 that he would come back and haunt, I think he's implying his family members, if they disregarded his wishes to keep the Wax Museum open and close it. So one of the most incredible sources I stumbled upon while researching this miniseries is a woman named Cassandra Wims. And I mentioned the Schomburg. So Raven used to go to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and conduct research for his wax museum there. Well, today you can go to the Schomburg and research Raven Chanticleer, because he has an archive there. And I went there in the summer of, I guess it was 2024, coming up on 2 years ago. And I was going through his papers, going through his piles. There were like all these newspaper clippings about the Wax Museum. You could see some of his fashion designs from the 70s. I saw the thank you note from Richard Nixon, which is how I know that he definitely sent that tie. But in there, I came across an article with the title, "Wims is a Winner." I was like, Wims? What's that all about? It's an article about this woman named Cassandra Wims, who is a very engaged activist. She's doing all kinds of things. She danced with Sun Ra for 15 years and was a radio journalist now. And she received some award. And I was like, why is this even in this file right now? Like, who is Cassandra Wims? And then at the end of the piece, there is a paragraph that explains why. She had been named, I believe it was head of the board of trustees for the African American Wax Museum. And I was like, I didn't know there was a board of trustees for the African American Wax Museum. What's that all about? So I tracked her down and gave her a call. And I was like, hey, my name's Gavin Whitehead. I'm doing a project on this guy named Raven Chanticleer. Does that name ring a bell for you? And she said, he was the love of my life. I was like, okay. Again, this is really interesting because supposedly the story we have about Raven is that he was gay. Yeah. And it actually turns out that, like a lot of gay men in his generation, he developed really powerful relationships with women that sat somewhere between friendship and romance. And so I got to talking with Cassandra. They dated in the last years of his life. They would argue in French before going about Raven's smoking, and then go out to have a meal at one of their favorite French restaurants, because it turns out they had both spent time in France. And Cassandra was doing a lot of work to try and spread the word about the African American Wax Museum, apply for grants, that kind of thing. And then Raven got sick in, we'll say 2001, 2002. He had lung cancer. Mm-hmm. And she visited him in the hospital on the last day of his life. And one of the things he literally asked her to do on his deathbed was save my museum. Wow. And yeah. And again, this was his dream. This was his life's work. And then he passed away, and Cassandra Wims received a phone call from the family. And they basically informed her that, according to her, in her words, she had no say-so. So they were going to take over, and there was nothing she could do. And it's really interesting because it turns out that the African American Wax Museum is not the only wax museum devoted to Black history. There's also one in Baltimore called the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum. And I'll spare the details right now, but you can learn a lot about why Raven's enterprise closed by looking at the history of Great Blacks and Wax, which remains open to this day and is in the middle of a something like a $76 million expansion project. And it started with two people. Two people opened it in 1980, and it has just grown and grown and grown and grown. Whereas Ravens did not outlive the founder, you know. And part of why Great Blacks and Wax was able to continue was that it was started by a married couple, and one of them died unexpectedly, and the other one expressed this commitment to keeping the museum alive because it was what she and her husband had just sacrificed everything, like so much for to keep this museum open. So Raven lacked a spouse. Someone who could inherit the museum when he passed away, who cared about keeping it open. His family, I won't say why they made their decisions, but they did not place as much value, obviously, in the Wax Museum as Cassandra Wims might have, had she been in a position to do what Raven wanted her to do and keep the museum going.
Wow. I mean, that's already a shocking twist with the Cassandra Wims being the love of his life and everything like that. Like I was not expecting that, you know, between Nixon and the Cassandra thing and he was not apparently actually from Harlem. There's so many twists in this story, and I am definitely starting to see why there was always more to unpack, and this had to be a series and not a single episode. Can you give us just, without any spoilers, a little taste of some of the other mysteries that you're running down in the series? Yeah.
So, early on in the project, I discovered a blog post from, I think it's either 2016 or 2015. And it was by a blog called Harlem Bespoke. And this blog had actually written about Raven Chanticleer and the African American Wax Museum several times before. And of course, by this time, the Wax Museum was long defunct. Raven had been dead for years. But the guy who ran this blog was clearly interested in him. So anyway, I came across this blog post called Raven Chanticleer Lost and Found. And it turns out that while in fact, the New York Times by this point had reported that all of Raven's wax figures had been long trashed by his family because they disapproved of his sexual identity. But it turns out that some had survived and been kind of rediscovered. And in this blog post, they talk about an interior designer whose name is never given. He retrieved these wax figures from wherever it was they were discovered. He was a multi-talented artist, much like Raven Chanticleer. He restored them, and then he was able to donate 2 of those wax figures to a museum in New York called the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art, which is dedicated to LGBT artists. And then in this blog post, it also said, but there are some other wax figures still left over. So please come forward and claim them if you want. So when I found this blog post, I was like, who is this interior designer? Whatever happened to those other wax figures that were left over? How did any of this happen? And which wax figures actually went to the Leslie Lohman? Because none of that information was in this blog post. And let me tell you, I spent like weeks trying to get in touch with this mysterious, unnamed interior designer. And bit by bit, I was able to track him down to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and finally got him on the phone. And let me tell you, I think I said at the beginning of this interview, this is part character study about Raven Chanticleer, and it is a detective story about what happened to all these wax figures. But I am really interested in these people who spent a lot of time and effort trying to preserve the Wax Museum in however they could. So I was really interested to talk to this guy, this interior designer. And let me tell you, his story it's like unbelievable. He first found out about Raven Chanticleer when he was living in Scottsdale, Arizona. And this was back in the 90s when the Wax Museum was still open. Fast forward 2 decades later, he is in a position, this interior designer, to rescue what little of Raven's life's work remains. And that's what he did. So it's just like, it was just, yeah. So that's one of the mysteries I was, chasing down.
Wow, this is just such an amazing story. Like, there's so many twists and turns in this, and such a kind of amazing cast of characters in this whole story playing out. Can you tell us some of the other cool people who are entering the orbit of, Raven and this museum and all of that?
So another person I spoke to for this project who was a really surprising discovery for me, that's how I experienced it. Again, in this archive at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, I came across a brochure for the African American Wax Museum. And in that brochure, it mentioned that Raven had an apprentice named, his name is Boye Benro. And to my knowledge, that is the only time the name of Boye Benro appears in any literature about the African American Wax Museum at all. So I was like, okay, who's this guy? Looked him up, and it turns out that he rose to prominence in Nigeria as a political cartoonist, and then illustrating for major publications there, came to New York and won a lot of attention as someone who would just start painting portraits out on the street. And he was in New York because he was attending the School of Visual Arts there. So he was a student, and also in his free time, he would just paint around New York City. Crowds would gather and watch because he was painting oil on canvas. It was black and white. It looked almost like charcoal, what he was doing. But his paintings were just unbelievably lifelike. And it was like they were just about to step out of the canvas, right? And one day Raven sees him and is like, hey, you're really good. Do you want to come help me work at my wax? Come help me with my wax museum? He's like, why not? So Boye, to cut a long story short, works there for a little bit. And then as soon as he graduates college, he leaves the museum and New York to go illustrate for Disney. And he goes on to contribute visual effects to classics like Mulan, Pocahontas, Hunt for El Dorado, all these major Disney movies from the mid to late 90s, and I want to say the early 2000s as well. It's just I just could not believe how many amazing artists entered Raven's orbit over the course of his lifetime. He was drawn to great artists, and they were drawn to him, and that's another component to why he just fascinated me so much.
That is fascinating. And, hats off to you for having the persistence for a year and a half spent putting all of this together. And for any listeners who are as fascinated as I am and want to learn more, the podcast is called Raven, and you can find it. I'll put, like I said, links in the show notes, but you can find it on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. But thank you so much for taking the time and shedding the light on this amazing, twisting story. Gavin Whitehead, really appreciate it.
Kyle, thanks again for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.